source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. It was one of the most sinister crimes ever committed in British Columbia. The investigation begins in the cold, powerful waters of the Fraser River near Vancouver and ends in a crack house that is as well known to police as it is to the addicts and sex trade workers who gather there. The resulting trial will be one of the most difficult ever held in the province. In 2001, RCMP Detective Peter Cross is the lead investigator assigned to a particularly mysterious case, what is commonly referred to as a John Doe homicide.
We had some information that somebody had been killed inside a house in the north part of Surrey.
On May 12th, 2001, an individual came forward to the police, and he wasn't an informant, he was a witness, and he spoke of having viewed not a person being killed, but the aftermath of such.
We were investigating that, even though we had no idea who the victim was. There was pretty good information.
The house where John Doe was reported to have died is located in Whalley, a low-income neighborhood in Surrey. It's a rundown area and has a high level of crime and violence because of the number of drug addicts who continue to feed their habit. The investigators decide to request a warrant to search the house.
When we searched the house originally, we did it in such a way as the occupants of the house didn't necessarily know what we were looking for.
While conducting the search, the investigators make some gruesome discoveries. Peter Cross dubs it the House of Horrors.
The reason it became termed the House of Horrors is that we eventually did search warrants on the residence, on 2 different occasions, actually. And on one occasion, we went in and looked for fingerprints, for blood, for anything along those lines. And some of those, the blood impressions were pretty graphic because one was a palm print, on a floorboard in blood. So you know that this is not something that's the result of somebody using needles or something. It's something that's the result of a crime.
The house is a disaster and should be demolished.
Inside it was totally shabby and run down.
There's food everywhere, there's garbage everywhere, there's property everywhere. Filthy clothes and cigarette butts and empty alcohol bottles and cans and drug paraphernalia, and it's filthy.
We found piles and piles of new clothes with tags on them, so obviously they're stealing the clothes in exchange for the dope. It was what normally you'd encounter in what they call the crack shack.
There were a number of drug users in the residence at the time, as well as the tenant and some of his associates.
According to police, the tenant, Joe Lagasse, was the person running the house and dealing the drugs. Some people come forward with disturbing information.
They were telling horrendous stories about the torture, where if they didn't come up with the $25 or $50 they needed, that they would get their hair cut, or they get a finger broken, or they'd be made to have sex with other people in the house. I've been on the job 30 years, so you see a lot of violence. I think the concentrated form of this violence in this one house to what these sex trade workers were going through, it's the kind of file that sticks with you because of that, and the level of violence for such little money.
When you combine that with the information that we're getting from all these people on the street about how people are being beaten and tortured in that residence, it kind of gives you a good picture of what might be happening.
One of the women at the house during the search offers some particularly troubling information to the investigators.
She was a heroin addict, very down and out, and in the midst of her interview, she broke down and she finally told us, you know, I know about the homicide, and started referring to the victim as a she as opposed to a he, and that kind of cued everybody in that something else was going on here, and we felt that she was reliable. She had a lot of good information.
The woman says she was at the house a few weeks earlier when a girl was being tortured in the bathtub.
She actually walked in to use the bathroom when this was going on. So that was the main tie-in, the primary evidence that we had at that time.
Because of her confession, a number of other drug addicts overcome their fear and come forward with their own information about the incident.
These people were all really scared. Talking to the police in that world is not looked upon fondly, and you know, they all feel very endangered by it. So it was a struggle to get any information from anybody, but that's predominantly how we started understanding that at least one other person had been killed there.
And we were about 2 or 3 weeks into that investigation when the body floated up in New Westminster.
In June of 2001, a passerby discovers a body floating by the dock in New Westminster Quay, a city near Vancouver. He alerts the police immediately. Forensic Identification Officer Fred Ralston is dispatched to the scene.
It was on June 4th, 2001. I was working a day shift and I just got a phone call that they had recovered a body in the Fraser River, and they just wanted us to come down there and take some photographs before they had taken her out of the river. There were a number of police officers there at the scene, and I noted that there was a body in the river, and it was face down, but it was fairly obvious just from the general outline of the person that it appeared to be female.
Facial features and all those kinds of things are definitely blurred. Of course, water being the most difficult body to find as far as a forensic, because water destroys and animal life destroys what you have fairly quickly.
The current is very strong. The rescuers must work quickly so that the body is not carried away by the river.
Our first concern was to try to get her out of the water without disturbing the body, and more importantly, not letting her go and head down the Fraser River again. So after some discussion, we decided that the dive team from the RCMP would come there and retrieve the body.
The New Westminster Police Department doesn't have its own dive team. The RCMP divers must be brought in.
The feet and hands were bound together. Quite frankly, that's suspicious enough for us to call in homicide. Generally speaking, you don't get anybody trying to commit suicide or trying to drown themselves with their feet and hands tied together. So it was evident to us that this was in fact a homicide, and we had to be very careful in the extraction of the body. We bagged the body in the water. That way we'll preserve things like paper falling out of pockets or perhaps an earring. And then we cut little slits in the bag and let the water rush out that way. The idea, of course, is to get the water out of the bag because water weighs, an awful lot, but it drains in such a way that we can preserve items that might fall out. In this particular case, you want to double that up with a Stokes stretcher so that you can actually control the amount of water that comes out of the bag at any given time. Once the body's up on dry land, it's almost immediately turned over to the homicide investigators.
Detective Constable Meaden and myself, we went down, followed the body down to the Royal Columbian Hospital morgue, and we went in there for obvious reasons, just to see if there was a wallet or anything on her that would tell us who she was.
Many questions remain unanswered. How did the victim end up in the Fraser River? How long has the body been in the water? Will an autopsy be able to determine the victim's identity? The RCMP are investigating the murder of a man in a crack house known as the House of Horrors. They learn a woman has been beaten in the bathroom of the same house. At the same time, a body is discovered floating in the waters of the Fraser River near Vancouver, British Columbia. The body is transported to the morgue at the Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. The pathologist conducts an autopsy on the badly decomposing body.
Une autopsie médico-légale.
A forensic autopsy involves a number of steps. When the body arrives, the first step is an external examination. We look at the clothes and the skin. We're looking for signs of cuts or tears in the clothes, or signs of trauma in the skin. Is there any evidence there? Are there fragments of fiber that were torn from the attacker? Are there any body fluids from the attacker, blood or semen? So we might take samples of any number of different things found on the clothes and skin. Then we undress the body, and we go through the same procedure without the clothes.
When the body bag is opened, the sex is confirmed, but nothing is found that might help identify the woman.
Bodies in water, especially when it's cold, probably decompose less than if you had the body on the outside where it's exposed to the elements. She actually had a piece of the packaging tape wrapped around the back of her head, through her mouth, and then around to the back of her head again. So her face was distorted quite a bit.
She was wearing a sweater and a pair of jeans, which might not have that much significance, except for the jeans were very obviously not her pants. They were brand new pants. They still had stickers and tags on them, and they were too small. Somebody had a struggle actually putting this clothing on her.
7 stab wounds were found on the woman's arms, back, and thighs. Yet there is no evidence of cuts or tears in her clothing.
I did look at her hands because I knew that I'd eventually have to fingerprint her, and she had degloved, which is a way of saying that the outer layer of her skin had come off. But even at that, she was in very good shape, and I had no reason to believe that I wouldn't be able to get a good set of fingerprints from her that would be identifiable.
Le liquide qui s'accumule dans le corps à cause de la
As a result of decomposition, moisture accumulates in the body between the outer layer of the skin, the epidermis, and a deeper layer called the dermis. And the epidermis becomes detached. Around the hands, we are left with something like a glove, which must be removed very, very carefully. The forensic expert puts on a latex glove to protect their hand and then fits the salvaged skin over it in order to take the fingerprints. If this skin glove has been lost in the water and we have been unable to retrieve it, the forensic expert can still take fingerprints from the dermis. It's not as effective, but it still works.
The victim's hands and ankles have been tied with yellow rope.
They might be some unusual knot that a person might link to some particular job or hobby. And if it's preserved properly, the knot specialist can look at it and maybe give us some information.
The rope bindings we took some interest in and spent a little time on that. We sent those off actually to a rope expert to determine knots and how they were tied, and we try to use that as a tie-in later on in the investigation.
Once the victim's hands are untied, the forensic technician can start taking fingerprints.
First at the postmortem, it was not possible to get a good set of fingerprints from her, so unfortunately we had to remove all of the fingers. As soon as we were finished the postmortem, we came back and we got 4 digits that were very, very good.
Often When we find someone like that and we don't know who they are, that's the first thing we'll check. It's the easiest, because if they've ever been involved in the justice system, we'll have their fingerprints on file. The only other reason we do it is for other people who pass away and we already know their identity. If they do have a criminal record, we'll take their fingerprints simply to send them into Ottawa so they can be removed from the national data bank.
Fred Rolston sends the prints from the 4 digits to the Vancouver database for verification. No matches are found. So the prints are sent on to be checked against the national database in Ottawa. Despite Rolston's efforts, the second search yields nothing.
Spent some time again, and I got all 10 digits. Contacted Ottawa. It took them maybe a couple hours, and it came back, and again, it was negative. I was disappointed because I felt if she'd been fingerprinted previously, there was no reason why they couldn't identify her, but they didn't.
The fingerprints provide no leads. Have the investigators come up against the perfect crime? The team must now look for other clues that might reveal the woman's identity.
There was a large scorpion tattoo with red eyes, and I think there was 2 red dots in the tail on her upper left shoulder. The scorpion tattoo was kind of the thing that we focused on in the early stages of the investigation as a possible means of identifying her.
They are now banking on the scorpion tattoo. Despite the condition of the body, they are able to take a clear photo. They release it to the media throughout the province. In the meantime, Constable Rolston receives fingerprints from 4 people who have been reported missing. He compares them to the victim's fingerprints. Once again, there are no matches. Then he receives another lead.
Finally, someone had phoned in and said that there was a missing person in Coquitlam that they hadn't seen for some time, so had one of our members go over to Coquitlam, pick up the prints, and brought them back.
A week has now passed since the body was discovered, and the investigators are still empty-handed. Will this latest lead help them solve the mystery of the victim's identity? A woman's body is found in the Fraser River near a dock in New Westminster, British Columbia. It's badly decomposed. The arms and legs are tied. The investigators have just received the fingerprints of a missing woman from the neighboring city of Coquitlam. This time, the prints match. The woman can finally be identified. Her name is Annette Allen.
I know that she was from Saskatchewan. I believe that she had a mom still in Saskatchewan, and I believe that she had a brother as well.
Annette has lived in British Columbia for some time, but she has no family there. Her disappearance was never reported.
She had started dating an individual who was heavy into drug use and the drug trade, and he went off to jail actually a short time after they started dating, and Annette moved into a relative's of his because she came and went and wasn't very consistent with the way that she lived her life. The lady that she was living with didn't even realize that she was missing until her body was found, and they broadcast through the media the pictures of the tattoos.
In cases like this, especially where there is trauma that may have contributed to the death, it is standard procedure to order toxicology tests. The results reveal high levels of drugs in Annette's system, consistent with those of a drug addict.
She did have what would be a textbook lethal dosage of heroin in her system. She also had cocaine and I believe alcohol.
Once Annette's identity is discovered, the New Westminster Police Department contacts Peter Cross. They believe there is a connection to the John Doe case he is currently working on.
And so we investigated a little further, and we were able to tie the girl to this particular house that we were already investigating.
The case is immediately transferred to the Surrey detachment of the RCMP, and Peter Cross becomes the lead investigator. The investigators learn that Annette Allen used to frequent The Stroll, an area of Whalley where prostitutes ply their trade. They also discover that she was with a woman named Joanna Larson on April 22nd, the day she was last seen alive.
Joanna Larson had brought her to that house. And the information at that time was that Joanna Larson had a beef with Annette Allen. And there's where sort of the real crux of the investigation started. What happened in that house?
It was linked quite quickly that she had passed away in that house, or that it had started there.
The investigators still do not have enough evidence to make an arrest. So a second, more thorough search of the house is ordered.
We took the drain pipes out of the house. We did everything. I would say we spent in total probably 2.5, 3 days examining that house.
Peter Cross has heard disturbing rumors about the backyard of the House of Horrors.
We had so much information of people coming forward, the street people in particular. We thought, we've got to cover this off. There's just too many people talking about bodies in the backyard.
For the second search, he decides to use an untried technology called ground-penetrating radar. At the time, Cross is one of the first people in his detachment to use it.
You can use it for pretty well anything. What you get is just like a radar image that you would see on a scope that you see when they're running radar anywhere. And it will bring out the shape and size. So if you're looking for a coffin or you're looking for a shotgun, the shape will actually come back at you. And what it measures is the disturbances in the soil. If you're looking for a body, it's going to show up as a body.
The radar reveals no sign of bodies buried in the backyard.
Well, we sort of came to the conclusion that this was one of the ways they threatened people that were coming into the house.
The second search warrant leads to the discovery of 27 DNA profiles in the house, but it does not yield a single trace of Annette Allen or any evidence of her murder. Either the informants are lying, or someone has done a very thorough job of covering up their crime.
To this day, we have still 27 unknown DNA profiles. All those DNA profiles are blood profiles. So that's blood that's been expended in that house from 27 different people. And we still have yet to tie it into anybody in particular.
The House of Horrors is shut down, and Joe Lagasse is arrested and charged as an accessory to the murder of Annette Allen. But he is quickly released.
After the preliminary hearing, I decided the evidence simply wasn't there in regards to Lagasse, so he was not charged on indictment with murder or manslaughter.
Although he was a promising suspect, Lagasse now walks away a free man.
It was a legal decision as opposed to a common sense decision, in my opinion, because of the legal loopholes in what his role was. I think the average member of the public, when they hear what his role was, they would say, well, of course he's guilty. The problem is the legal system doesn't necessarily match up to what the average Joe thinks.
The only leads the investigators have left are eyewitness accounts that point to two possible suspects, Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier.
Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier would be considered friends. Francis was kind of the doorman of that house, worked and lived there, and Jojo went there all the time. We had information which made us believe that the two of them had actually discussed committing a homicide, and that they kind of jibed at each other at points saying, oh, you couldn't kill anybody, or you couldn't do it.
The witnesses are drug addicts, and this does not help matters. Peter Cross is not sure their accounts are reliable.
The nature of their drug illness makes them extremely difficult to deal with and extremely difficult to corroborate their information. And and count on them.
Cross decides to forge ahead with what little information he has.
The investigative avenue we thought would work and would be our best avenue was the undercover route.
The first undercover operation targets Joanna Larson. It's not long before she's providing information about her role in the death of Annette Allen.
She was definitely, in my opinion, a braggart. Like, she was quite pleased to talk about it.
It turns out that Larson had previously taken part in a robbery and was convinced that Allen had been an informant.
We could confirm later on, obviously, that she wasn't in that case, but that was their belief, was that she was ratting them out.
There was also a $20 drug debt in there, too, that Annette owed someone $20, and that this was a bit of a point of contention with Joanna as well. Annette showed up and they kind of coerced her into the house on the premise that, you know, she was going to be given some drugs. And I think it was pretty immediate after she entered the house, and that they tied her up and put her in the bathtub.
Annette Allen is assaulted, stabbed, and beaten with a hammer. Larson boasts about the part she played in the attack, but says a man named Francis Gauthier was the instigator.
Basically, Joanna Larson confessed to being there and what happened, but put the majority of the blame on Mr. Gauthier.
But Larson's accusation against Gauthier would not be admissible in a court of law. In order for it to be used as evidence, a confession from Gauthier himself would be required.
They knew, certainly, for sure, they knew Gauthier was involved. One thing to know someone's involved, it's another thing to have evidence that you can use against that person. So that's why the second undercover operation was used.
Joanna Larson is arrested and charged with the murder of Annette Allen. Police launched the undercover operation targeting Francis Gauthier.
The challenge, of course, was hoping that they didn't somehow come together once we'd started the second, so that one would talk to the other as to what was going on.
Will Gauthier be as quick as Larson to give information to the undercover operator? Will his story be the same? Will police get the evidence they need to arrest Annette Allen's killer? The body of Annette Allen has been retrieved from the Fraser River. Her death is traced back to a crack house located in Surrey, British Columbia, that police refer to as the House of Horrors. However, 2 searches have not turned up the slightest trace of Annette's DNA in the house. The investigators have completed an undercover operation targeting Joanna Larson. Armed with the allegations Larson has made about Francis Gauthier, the police launch a second undercover operation.
He was introverted, quiet, not very comfortable with himself.
Obviously, he has some violent tendencies to do what he did, but you don't get that same sort of killer impression from Francis Gauthier that you get from Joanna Larson.
I think it was a little bit more difficult for him to talk about it, but in the end, he seemed quite pleased with himself as well.
Gauthier eventually recounts his versions of the events.
He was sleeping on the couch when Joanna Larson brought Annette Allen to this house and began torturing her.
According to Gauthier, Annette Allen arrived at the house to buy drugs. As soon as she arrived, Larson forced her into the bathroom and started torturing, stabbing, and beating her. The torture continues for many hours. When she's had enough, she recruits Francis Gauthier to help her trunk Alan.
What was referred to on the street as being trunked, and that term referred to being beaten, having your head shaven, and being thrown in a trunk and driven around as, you know, a form of punishment or a way of convincing you that you need to pay your bills.
Annette is unconscious and barely alive. Francis and Joanna wrap her in a plastic shower curtain. Then they lock her in a trunk of a car that is parked beside the house.
This residence also had normally multiple cars parked in the driveway, most of them without license plates or insurance, and it was kind of typical to have one good set of license plates and you just switch that to whichever car you chose to drive that day.
Initially, it was still daylight, so they waited for a while down in the Surrey area, the North Surrey area.
Larson and Gauthier drive around for several hours looking for a suitable place to dump Alan. They stop under the Alex Fraser Bridge. A heated argument erupts. While the two accomplices try to come to a decision, Alan manages to open the trunk. Larson and Gauthier realize what's happening, and they tie her up before heading back out. In their state of panic, they don't notice that they've been spotted. The man goes home and calls 911 to report what he witnessed. Eventually, Larson and Gauthier end up in New Westminster.
Right at the New Westminster Quay. Like, it was about 100 yards up from where the body was found.
Alan begs them not to kill her. Gauthier strangles her. He and Larson throw her body into the Fraser River. Gauthier's confession to the undercover agents is the evidence the police need to lay charges against him. Gauthier is arrested for the murder of Annette Allen. The arrests of Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier brings Peter Cross closer to his goal. But he knows he still has his biggest challenge ahead of him, putting the offenders behind bars. What makes this case especially difficult is the fact that the witnesses and informants are drug addicts.
From an investigator's standpoint, it's horrendous. And then when you get into the court process, it becomes even more horrendous.
Totally unreliable. You might as well forget them coming in for an interview. If they do, it's a bit of a miracle. Unlikely to come to the court, even though they know they're supposed to. So you'd have to send the police off to pick them up and bring them in.
We have a lot of challenges with memory, recollection, how cognizant people were when the incidents occurred, fear, intimidation.
We were told from the very beginning, you'll never get this to court because the people will never come through it. Unless somebody's willing to step forward, you do not have a case. And it's a very difficult thing to prove.
Peter Cross and his team have an enormous task ahead of them. They begin preparing for the trials of Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier. Christopher McPherson is selected as Crown Prosecutor. His extensive experience as a defense lawyer dealing with drug addicts makes him the ideal person to prosecute this case.
Maybe that gave us a bit of an advantage in the sense of I've dealt with people like this for years and years and years in my office or interviewing them.
His experience also tells him he is facing an uphill battle in the case of Annette Allen.
We knew there were problems with it from the get-go. Sure, there was tape and there was rope and there was clothing, but none of that could be tied back to the house in any way. It was just basic stuff you could get anywhere. There was nothing that one could say was the weapons that were used in the assault. There were knives in the house, but there was nothing that you could say was used. The beating and stabbing took place in the bathroom, in the tub, and there was certainly evidence of cleaning up with bleach and things like that. I think, as I recall, I checked the trap of the tub, couldn't find anything. There was basically no physical evidence to tie Annette Allen to the house at all.
Even though Annette had been wrapped in plastic, he finds it very surprising that investigators were unable to find any forensic evidence in the car.
If we could have put Annette Allen in that car with a forensic evidence, that would have made the case a lot stronger.
Without any forensic evidence whatsoever, the prosecution's success will depend on two things: the undercover operations and the accounts of drug-addicted witnesses, both of which present significant problems. In Larson's case, it is by no means certain whether the information gathered during the undercover operation will be admissible in court. Some of the things she said contradict the evidence collected when the body was recovered.
Because they were so drug addicted, just their sheer recollection or perception is just skewed. They don't remember things. So even if they're not trying to lie, it's like they don't have a complete grasp of what's going on around them anyways.
With no forensic evidence and unreliable witnesses, the odds are heavily stacked against the prosecution. Three people have been charged in relation to the death of Annette Allen. Her body was found in the Fraser River in New Westminster, British Columbia in June of 2001. Joe Lagasse has been acquitted for lack of evidence connecting him to the murder. The prosecution is preparing cases against Francis Gauthier and Joanna Larson. The suspects and the witnesses are heavily addicted to drugs, and this complicates the case considerably. Since these are the only witnesses available to the prosecution, one obvious solution presents itself. Investigators take the witnesses under their care and enroll them in a detox program so that they'll be able to participate fully in the trial.
It's up to the cop to increase the credibility of the drug addict turned witness, and one of the best ways to do this is to convince and assist the addict in abstaining for at least the duration of the court process. And hopefully they can provide the support services they need to remain sober.
It's not an easy task, but it's certainly worth a try.
They did an amazing job with 2 or 3 of the witnesses and making sure they were always there for them, taking them for coffee after, and keeping them on the straight and narrow, giving them a place to call if they started to feel like they were going to slip onto the other side.
I've got to give the police a lot of credit, because even though, it's a killing in the middle of for the whole drug scene, they worked very, very hard and continued to work very hard right through the whole case. Because it was one of those cases that, okay, you've got enough evidence to charge a person, well, that's nice. but half your witnesses aren't going to come.
But one of the witnesses that the investigators support becomes a key witness in the trial.
She was a woman who came to the house to buy drugs.
And had to use the washroom, and when she went in, Annette was in the bathtub. And she saw her.
There is one issue that complicates the case even more: determining the cause of death.
One of the issues that came in court was the levels of toxicity in her body with the various drugs. One of the defense arguments was that the drugs killed her. So that became an issue in court because we basically had to show that she was a drug addict, and therefore her levels of this, it wasn't like the average person taking drugs for the first time.
And, you know, yeah, she still had a really high level of drugs in her system at the time of her death. So there are lots of questions like that. You know, were they injecting her with drugs? Is that not what actually happened? You know, was the time span much less than what they described? And you have to crack it up to they were both using drugs at the time too, and you know, how accurate are those time frames?
One thing I find whenever there's witnesses who are heavily addicted to drugs, time is completely elastic. To try to figure out when something occurred approaches the impossible.
The prosecution has no tangible evidence, no cause of death, and unreliable witnesses. Finally, the trial date arrives, and the first person on the stand is Francis Gauthier. Following their preliminary hearings, which are several months apart, Francis Gauthier and Joanna Larson are charged with first-degree murder in the death of Annette Allen.
It wasn't a case that improved with time. Some of the witnesses became even less reliable. And I eventually agreed to take pleas to manslaughter on both of them.
The Crown was willing to take a plea with regard to manslaughter because predominantly when all of your witnesses are precariously perched on the edge of being able to testify and not being able to testify, if you go to trial and you have 10 so-so witnesses and defense starts taking them down and ruining their credibility, you can often end up with no good witnesses.
On November 5th, 2004, Francis Gauthier is sentenced to 18 years in prison for manslaughter. On June 2nd, 2005, Joanna Larson also receives 18 years. The court's decision represents an enormous victory for everyone involved in solving Annette Allen's murder.
We all had a relationship with Annette Allen in the sense that we thought that she was a legitimate victim and that this never should have happened, and it was tragic and horrific.
We were pretty pleased with the 18 years when it all is said and done, because that's probably at the very high end of manslaughter that you'll ever see.
I feel great every time I think about it, that it ended the way it did and that people went to jail and there was some justice for her death. For sure, my biggest lesson ever in being a police officer is that every one of those people have a story and a reason for where they are. And if you actually just sit down and listen, you're gonna maybe have a little bit more understanding and appreciation for the spot they're in.
We had a good investigative team. We did a good job on that file. It's one of those files that you're proud of at the end of the day. It's one of those files that you get asked about all the time. It's one of those files that people remember, that hit the media and the general public knows of it. And it's one of those cases where you actually see some good come of everything that you did.
The outcome of the trial has repercussions in the community.
We saw an impact on that little Wally community where nobody seemed to pay attention to them, and the neighbors constantly complained that the police wouldn't take them seriously.
The mayor, at the end of this, bulldozed the house and destroyed it. And I think it was kind of a symbolic gesture to say, we're taking care of these things and these crack shacks are going to be disposed of and dealt with accordingly.
To this day, the John Doe case is still being investigated.